Unit 6 Big Ideas. Let's look at the time period after the Civil War, the roughly 35 years after the Civil War. We've mentioned the term Industrial Revolution in this class before. We've talked about, some people might argue an industrial revolution begins before the Civil War. If you look at the rise of factories, if you look at that increased industrial output of the North, you could make that argument. However, I think there's a better argument to be made that the Industrial Revolution in the United States doesn't take place until after the Civil War. It's not until after the Civil War that we get to a point where more than half of the nation's workers are working in industry, are not working in agriculture. An industrial revolution is when a country goes through, I think, three big changes. A shift from homemade goods to factory-made goods. A shift from man-made goods to goods made at least with the help of machines. And a shift from most people working on farms to most people working in factories. If we're talking about before the Civil War, a little review here as well. Remember, we talked about immigration before the Civil War. And we obviously still had immigrants coming to the United States from England and Scotland. That really never stops. But before the Civil War, we also saw a significant increase in people from a few distinct nations. We saw a rise in immigration from Ireland. And we could say that those immigrants were pushed out of Ireland as a result of the potato famine and the economic hardship in Ireland. They were poor immigrants. They sailed over in what were called coffin ships. And because they were so economically distressed, they were really forced to stay in those East Coast cities like New York and Boston. We also talked about a large number of immigrants coming from German kingdoms. And these immigrants, more than the Irish, were more pulled to America by the opportunities presented by the United States. Some of them came as a result of failed democratic revolutions in the German region in the 1840s. Because they came more willingly, they had more money. And because they had more money, they were able to purchase land and move to the Midwest and become farmers. It's why so many people in places like Ohio have German heritage. We also know, third on that list would probably be people from Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden. And they're more similar to the German immigrants than the Irish immigrants. And they moved to oftentimes the upper Midwest, like parts of Michigan, but especially Wisconsin and Minnesota. This increase in immigration led to a backlash of nativism, a reaction of opposition to immigration to America, culminating in the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, which was a third party focused on limiting or curtailing immigration. Moving on to the time period after the Civil War. The time period after the Civil War, the 35 years after the Civil War, are sometimes called the Gilded Age. All right? The Gilded Age refers to gilding metal, which is when you go through the process of hammering gold down so that it is super thin, so that it becomes what's called gold leaf. And then you take that gold leaf and you press it onto another less expensive metal, like aluminum or iron. Cover a cheaper metal in gold and it's going to look more prosperous. But you can use a wafer-thin amount of gold to do that, which means that in reality, that piece of metal that you covered in gold leaf is not really that much more valuable. This time period after the Civil War is called the Gilded Age because on the surface, it looks very, very prosperous. There's a rising gross domestic product. The total output of all the goods and services produced in America increases dramatically. Corporate profits are on the rise. Corporations are doing well. And the big wealthy owners of, majority owners of some of those corporations, like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts, or the bankers like JP Morgan, are doing very, very well for themselves. But just underneath, there are big problems in the economy. There's a growing gap in the rich versus the poor. Dangerous work conditions and other forms of exploitation of labor, especially child labor, women working, and immigrant labor. And that's not all. Horrible living conditions for most of the working class Americans in the Gilded Age means that under the surface, there are big economic problems in America. We'll also look at settlement of the West in this time period. This is when we get the beginning of significant settlement out west. California was settled with the gold rush, as well as other parts of the Pacific coast. It's in this end of the 1800s that a lot of the plains and the Rocky Mountain region will begin to be filled in with white settlers as well. Part of the reason for that is improvements in mechanization really helped agricultural production increase substantially. And for the nation, this contributes to a decline in food prices. Machines like the combine and the cord baler, barbed wire out on the plains is going to provide a cheap, efficient way to cordon off livestock when not much wood is available. So mechanized farming helps with that settlement, causes that settlement. Railroad companies are going to play an important part as well as they build transcontinental railroads and then sell off the land that they don't need. Government policy is a stimulating effect to the settlement of the West as government provides subsidies for settlers, provides cheap lands for settlers, provides loans to settlers and loans to railroad companies, and telegraph companies as well. Moving out west means that people are less disconnected and more willing to move out there. Mineral resources and the availability of gold and silver and copper also creates an impetus for Americans to move west. As a result, we get economic centers out west, oftentimes around mining strikes or points of trade. We also see farmers begin to organize. Farmers begin to come together, similar to how workers are going to form unions. The farmers organize first into a group called the Grangers, and then later we'll get the Farmers' Alliances, culminating in the Populist Party of the late 1800s and the 1890s. But we're also going to see conflict out west, conflict between ranchers and farmers, conflict between miners and Native Americans, conflict between miners and the American government, all kinds of conflict. And we still have Mexican Americans living in this region. Not necessarily people who moved up from Mexico recently, but people who might have settled there when the Mexican Cession was still part of Mexico. The Gilded Age is also going to see significant changes in capitalism. Significant changes, well, the emergence of industrial capitalism. Now, that has a lot to do with the growing transportation industry. Railroad companies and telegraph companies as well are going to emerge as powerful new players in the national economy. It's also going to be a direct result of some technological innovations, the Bessemer process, widespread use of the steam engine, new methods for smelting metals, but also smaller scale innovations like that sewing machine you see down there in the right. We're going to see the way businesses do business change as well, with advances in marketing and finance and changes in management, some of which were based on the experience of many people serving in the military during the Civil War. Maybe most importantly, we're going to see the formation of business trusts. And that's something we'll talk a lot about in this unit and in Unit 7. This is when businesses that normally compete agree to not compete to increase their profits. And it's really going to force the government to get more involved in the economy and regulation. We're going to see the growth or the emergence of even more American overseas trade.